Chapter 2 is over water, biochemistry, and the cell, and it covers a lot of ground. Just please realize that if this was in a traditional biology class, actually each of these would probably be a different chapter. You might even have multiple chapters over this. So this is a lot of information. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through kind of the high points. Make sure you use your study guide to help you study for the exam. And I'll kind of touch on some things that I don't have time to mention right now, but that will be on the exam. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the atom. So the atom is the basic, the smallest structure that we really understand currently. It is made up of three different particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Inside the nucleus, or the center of the atom, you have the protons and the neutrons. Protons are positively charged, so on this little sketch, they're the green balls, and they have a little positive charge next to them. Neutrons are also in the nucleus. They are neutrally charged. They don't have any charge at all. They're neutral. And then electrons have a negative charge, and they are in orbits that are actually outside of the nucleus. They're kind of floating around in space, and they're very, very tiny. So if you're talking about relative size, protons and neutrons are very large, and electrons are very, very small. So when we're giving the weight of an atom, the atomic weight, that is actually made up of the protons and the neutrons, because they're the only thing that has weight, because the electrons are so, so small. I mean, you can barely see them on this little diagram, and they are tiny, tiny, tiny. So they're negatively charged, and they're outside the nucleus. If you put several atoms together, then you get a molecule. So a molecule is kind of the next step up as far as size goes, and it's composed of multiple atoms together. When you join atoms together, typically the way that occurs is something is happening with the electrons in the outer rings. So either they are sharing the electrons, or they're giving an electron, or they're taking an electron. So that's kind of how chemical reactions occur, is this exchange of electrons, this exchange of negative energy. So in a polar covalent bond, covalent means sharing, so two atoms are going to be sharing electrons. But if it's a polar covalent bond, they are sharing them unequally. So one atom is greedier than the other atom, and it tends to hold on to those electrons a little bit longer. So in a polar covalent bond, in that molecule, typically one side of the molecule is going to be slightly more negative, and then the other side of the molecule is going to be slightly more positive, because one half of the molecule takes the electrons more, doesn't share them equally. It's kind of has them for a longer period of time than the other side. So that other side tends to be positively charged very slightly, and then the ones that hold on to the electrons tend to be negatively charged very slightly. In a nonpolar covalent bond, remember covalent means sharing, so the two atoms are sharing electrons. But if it's nonpolar, then they're sharing them equally. So that whole molecule, there isn't really one area of that molecule that has a charge versus another area of the molecule, because they're sharing the electrons equally. In an ionic bond, they're actually swapping electrons. So one atom steals the electrons from the other atom. So that means that the atom that has the electrons is now completely negatively charged, because it gained those electrons. And then the atom that lost the electrons is positively charged. And these two types of ions tend to gravitate towards one another, almost like two opposite ends of a magnet, how they're attracted. And an example of that actually be table salt. So sodium and chloride are two ions that cling together, and they make up table salt. A hydrogen bond is a very interesting bond. It's very specific. So what a hydrogen bond is, it's kind of a type of polar covalent bond almost. So in a polar covalent bond, we said in this particular type of bond in a molecule, there is one end of the molecule that's slightly positively charged, because it doesn't have the electrons as much, and then the other end of the molecule is slightly negatively charged, because it has the electrons more of the time. So an example of a molecule that does that, a polar molecule, is a water molecule. So a water molecule is made up of one oxygen and two hydrogens. And because of the way the electrons are shared, the oxygen tends to hog the electrons more. So the oxygen actually has a slightly negative charge to it. And then the hydrogens, because they don't have the electrons as much, they have a slightly positive charge to both of them. So in this molecule, this water molecule, what happens is those hydrogens kind of go off in one end and the oxygen's at the other end. So you've got a slightly positively charged end to the molecule and a slightly negatively charged end to the molecule. So if you have two water molecules, that are hanging out together, then what happens in a hydrogen bond is there's a very strong attraction between a hydrogen here that's slightly positively charged and an oxygen that's slightly negatively charged. And so they form this bond between them. It's not as strong as these other bonds we've talked about. It can be broken, but there is a bond between the positive hydrogen and the negative oxygen that's close by, and that's called a hydrogen bond. So this is why water tends to cling together. It's why you can siphon water. So if you start, water going downhill, it will tend to follow itself. This is why plants can actually get water up from their roots up into their leaves, because they draw it up because the water molecules cling together. So this is a very important characteristic. It allows us it allows water to have all of these various uses in the world because of these neat hydrogen bonds. Okay, some other terms. Quick, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So hydrophilic, philic is like phileo, it means love. Phobic is a fear, so it means hates or fears. So if you have a hydrophilic molecule, that is a molecule that loves water. So that is going to be the polar molecules and the ionic molecules. So if you have a polar molecule or an ionic molecule, they're going to be hydrophilic. If you have a non-polar molecule, because there's no charge anywhere, it actually doesn't like water. Because remember, water is charged. So you've got a charged area and a non-charged area. They don't tend to mix. It's oil and water, basically. So oil is hydrophobic. Oil will be considered non-polar, and that will be considered hydrophobic. All right, some other terms that are in your chapter that are important. Metabolism is the sum total of all of the chemical reactions that are happening in your cells, in your body at any given time. Homeostasis has to do with balance. So your body is trying to maintain a very delicate system of balance inside itself. So an example would be temperature. So your temperature is around 98.6 degrees on average. If it gets too low, then you die from hypothermia. If it gets too high and you have a fever, you can die from that. So your body is trying to regulate its internal temperature despite what's around you. So if it's cold outside, then your body maintains that warmer temperature. If it's hot outside, then your body maintains a slightly cooler temperature. So homeostasis is all of those very specialized things that are going on inside your body to keep everything even, to keep your blood pressure in appropriate ranges, to keep your heart rate appropriate, your amount of oxygen in your tissues, getting rid of carbon dioxide, all of that has to do with homeostasis. The cell is the fundamental structural and functional unit of living organisms on Earth. So if we're talking about size, remember atom is the smallest. If you put atoms together, then you get molecules. And then if you have lots of molecules together, you end up with a cell. So the cell would be larger than the atom or the molecules, but it is our structural and functional unit of life as we know it. So you can have atoms that are not alive, you can have molecules that are not alive, but if you have a cell, then it's going to be alive if it's functioning appropriately. In general, there are two types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus that has a membrane around it. They also have organelles that have membranes around them. Prokaryotic cells do not. They do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. And this is important because this is kind of how we classify organisms, is into these two big camps. So they're either prokaryotic or they're eukaryotic. And when we talk about bacteria and things like that, bacteria are considered prokaryotic. Animals, fungi, plants are all considered eukaryotic. So these are important terms to know for now and for later. You should definitely know the different organelles in the eukaryotic cell and how they work, their main job description. You should be able to match those up. That will be on the exam. The last couple things I want to go over would be the big macromolecules and then also the pH scale. So the macromolecules, macro means big, so these are the big molecules. We have carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Of these four, three of them are considered polymers, and polymers are made up of individual subunits that are repeated over and over. Those individual subunits are called monomers. So carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids are all made up of the smaller building blocks, just repeated over and over. So they're all considered to be polymers made up of monomers. When you're talking about carbohydrates, the monomer would be a monosaccharide, a simple sugar, one single sugar. Repeated over and over gives you a macromolecule or a polymer of the carbohydrate. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and the nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. And DNA and RNA are both considered nucleic acids. Enzymes are one type of protein, but proteins are everywhere. They have lots of functions in your body. And then carbohydrates, you're talking about like glucose, sucrose, the sugars, the simple sugars, the complex sugars, starch, cellulose in plants, all those be considered carbohydrates. Lipids are a little different. They are not made up of the same single unit repeated over and over. They're actually made up of several different units that are combined together in different ways to make different lipids. So they're not considered polymers because they don't really have a monomer. Lipids would be things like steroids. Cholesterol is very important in your body because you make all of your other hormones from that, estrogen, testosterone, all of that. Fats would be considered lipids. Fatty acids, long-chain fatty acids, short-chain fatty acids, things like that. They're also important in your cell membrane because that's made up of a phospholipid bilayer. So it's two phospholipid layers that are hanging out together with the polar ends facing out and the hydrophobic ends, the tails facing inward. That's very important. So make sure you know these macromolecules, what they're made of, their main purpose, examples of them, because that will be on the exam. And then the last thing I want to cover very quickly is the pH scale. The pH scale is a measure of acidity or basicity. 7 is neutral, so water is considered neutral. And then if you go up on the pH scale, you're getting more basic, or more alkaline is the other term for that. If you're going down on the pH scale, then you're getting more acidic. So 1 would be more acidic than 4. 8 would be more acidic than 10. 10 would be more basic than 8. 4 would be more basic than 2. So realize you can use those terms no matter where you are on the scale, more acidic, more basic, more alkaline. The way this is measured has to do with two different components. It has to do with hydroxide ions, and it has to do with hydrogen ions. So if you have a lot of hydrogen ions, then you're acidic. If you have a lot of hydroxide or OH negative ions, then you're basic. And so that's why water is considered neutral, because water has one hydrogen that can go with the on the acidic side, so one hydrogen ion, and then if you take the leftover hydrogen and the oxygen, that would be considered basic. That would be a hydroxide ion. So basically, when you put water and it dissociates, it stays in the middle. It's got one on each side. So water is considered neutral, but pretty much everything else falls along that scale. So you should understand how that scale works, what's considered basic, what's considered acidic, and that means that we're talking about the relative concentration of hydrogen ion and hydroxide ion in solution.